The photograph exists in 3 known copies. One remains in the archives of the Allegheny County Courthouse. Another was donated to the Western Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1962 by a woman who claimed no relation to the subject. The third, according to a 1984 interview with a retired postal clerk in McKees Rocks, was burned in a basement furnace sometime in the winter of 1931. The image shows a man of approximately 40 years, though the attending physician's notes suggest he was 32. His hair had gone entirely white. The photograph was taken on March 14, 1918, 6 days after he was discovered in the attic of a boarding house on Preble Avenue in Pittsburgh's Allegheny West neighborhood, and 15 years, 2 months, and 11 days after he was last seen in the company of 6 other men. His name was Thomas Edward Felton. He did not speak when they found him. The boarding house proprietor, a widow named Margaret Lusk, had purchased the building in January of 1918. She told the police that she'd heard sounds from the attic on 3 separate occasions. Not footsteps exactly, but a kind of settling, as though someone were shifting their weight from one foot to another. She attributed it to the house adjusting to the cold. It was her lodger, a railroad surveyor named Bill Coughlin, who insisted on investigating. Coughlin's written statement, filed with the Pittsburgh Police Department on March 9, 1918, describes the moment with restraint that barely conceals his shock. The attic access was nailed shut from the hallway side. I removed 4 boards. The space was approximately 12 feet by 18 feet, unfinished, with exposed rafters. There was a wool blanket in the northeast corner, folded once. A tin cup. A chamber pot. Empty. And the man, sitting with his back to the chimney stack, knees drawn up, watching the access door. He did not move when I called to him. He did not move when I climbed up. I asked his name. He looked at me but did not answer. His eyes were clear. I believed him to be in his right mind, only silent. When the police arrived, Thomas Felton allowed himself to be led down from the attic without resistance. He walked steadily. He accepted water. He used the facilities when directed. But he did not speak. A doctor was summoned. The medical examination, conducted at Allegheny General Hospital that same evening, revealed a man in surprisingly stable health, given the presumed conditions of his confinement. He was underweight by perhaps 20 pounds. His muscle tone suggested limited movement, but not complete immobility. There were no signs of violence, no restraint marks on his wrists or ankles, no indication of malnourishment severe enough to cause permanent damage. The doctor noted, with some confusion, that Felton's hands were clean. His fingerprints were taken. They matched records on file from 1903, when Thomas Felton had been briefly employed as a station clerk for the Pennsylvania Railroad. His identity was not in question. What was in question, what remained in question for the rest of his life, was where he had been, and what had happened to the 6 men who had gone with him into the Chestnut Ridge wilderness in January of 1903, none of whom were ever seen again. Thomas Felton was asked. He was asked by the police, gently at first, then with increasing urgency. He was asked by a state investigator reopening the 1903 case. He was asked by a priest, by a doctor trained in disorders of the mind, by his own sister, who traveled from Harrisburg and sat beside his hospital bed for 4 hours, holding his hand and weeping. He did not answer. His silence was not catatonic. He responded to direct physical questions, nodding when asked if he was in pain, shaking his head when offered food he did not want. He could write. When handed a pencil and paper, he wrote his name clearly. But when asked to write what had happened, he set the pencil down and folded his hands in his lap. The police pressed. They needed to know if there had been foul play. They needed to know if others were culpable. They needed to know if the 6 men might still, against all likelihood, be alive. Thomas Felton looked at them with those clear, pale eyes and said nothing. On March 22, 1918, after 14 days of observation, he was released from custody. No charges were filed because no crime could be proven. The case file from 1903 was reopened, then closed again within the month. The notation, written in the hand of Detective Lieutenant Francis Howell, reads simply, Subject unwilling to provide testimony. No evidence of wrongdoing. Case suspended pending further information. No further information ever came. Thomas Felton left the hospital and vanished into the city. There are sporadic records of his existence. A lease agreement in 1920 for a room on the north side, a baptismal sponsorship in 1923, a receipt for the purchase of a coat in 1927. But no interviews, no statements, no moments in which he broke his silence about the winter of 1903. He died in 1941 at the age of 55 of pneumonia. He was buried in a Catholic cemetery in Shaler Township. The funeral was attended by 4 people, none of them family. The priest who officiated later told a reporter that Thomas had been a regular at Mass, always sitting in the back, always alone. When asked if Thomas had ever come to confession, the priest said he had. When asked what Thomas had confessed, the priest reminded the reporter of the sanctity of the sacrament and said nothing more. In January of 1903, Thomas Felton was 17 years old. This detail is easily overlooked in later accounts, which tend to render him older, perhaps because of what he became. But in the winter of 1903, he was still young enough to be called Tommy by his mother, young enough to lack the vote, young enough that his participation in the expedition was considered a favor to his uncle, not a necessity. His uncle was Martin Felton, 41, a foreman with the Allegheny Timber Company. Martin had worked in the logging camps of western Pennsylvania since the age of 15. He was known as a man who could manage both men and terrain, who understood the temperament of a forest in winter, and who did not take unnecessary risks. His reputation was such that when the Allegheny Timber Company needed a small crew to survey a tract of old-growth forest in the Chestnut Ridge area, land the company was considering purchasing from a private estate, Martin was the obvious choice to lead. The expedition was not supposed to be dangerous. This cannot be emphasized enough. The area in question was remote, but not uncharted. The surveying work was expected to take no more than 10 days. The crew was experienced. The weather, while cold, was not predicted to be severe. It was, in the words of the company manager who approved the venture, routine. Martin Felton selected his crew carefully. There was James Callahan, 38, a timber cruiser who had worked with Martin for over a decade. Callahan was married with 3 children and known for his caution in the woods. He carried a compass on a chain and consulted it constantly, even on familiar trails. There was Peter Devine, 29, a sawyer's apprentice eager to prove himself worthy of advancement. Devine had a reputation for good humor and a strong back. He sang while he worked, mostly Irish ballads learned from his father. There was Otto Claassen, 35, a German immigrant who spoke limited English but was widely regarded as the best axeman in the company. Claassen sent half his wages back to a sister in Bavaria and kept the rest in a tobacco tin under his mattress. There was Samuel Reed, 42, the oldest of the crew, a camp cook who had volunteered to accompany the expedition because his wife had recently died and he preferred, he said, to keep moving. Reed had a flask he carried but was never seen drunk. And there was David Ames, 26, a surveyor's assistant with a new wife and a daughter born 3 months prior. Ames had requested the assignment. He wanted the additional pay. His wife, in later testimony, said he had promised to bring her back something pretty from the woods. And there was Thomas. Thomas, the youngest, brought along because Martin wanted to teach him the work, because the boy's father had died 2 years prior, and Martin felt a responsibility to the family, and because Thomas, by all accounts, was a serious and capable young man who did not complain. The crew assembled in the town of Ligonier on the morning of January 9th, 1903. They were provisioned for 12 days. They carried standard surveying equipment, axes, 2 rifles for game, wool blankets, tents, and a canvas tarp. A local guide named Henry Watts led them to the edge of the tract and provided directions to a logging road that ran north into the ridge. Watts later testified that the men were in good spirits, that Martin Felton had joked about being back in time for his daughter's birthday, and that Thomas had been quiet but attentive. Watts watched them disappear into the trees. He never saw any of them again. The relationships among the men were, by all surviving accounts, cordial. Martin Felton was respected. James Callahan was trusted. Peter Devine was liked. Otto Klassen was valued. Samuel Reed was tolerated with a kind of gentle sympathy. David Ames was admired for his youth and optimism. And Thomas was the boy. Interviews conducted in 1903 and again in 1918 with the families of the missing men reveal no significant tensions. There had been no arguments before the departure, no debts between them, no romantic entanglements, no disputes over wages or work assignments, no history of violence. They were, by all accounts, a competent and compatible crew. Martin Felton's wife, Catherine, described her husband as exacting but fair. She said he would not have taken the job if he thought it posed undue risk. She said he had kissed her goodbye at the door and told her to keep the stove going. James Callahan's eldest son, 9 years old at the time, remembered his father lifting him up to look at the stars the night before he left. He said you could navigate by them if you had to, the son recalled in a 1956 interview. He said a man who knew the stars couldn't get lost. Peter Devine's mother kept every letter he had ever written to her, including the one dated January 7, 1903, in which he mentioned the upcoming job and expressed excitement at the opportunity to see real wilderness, not just cut-over scrub. Otto Klassen's sister in Bavaria received a letter in March of 1903, posted from Allegheny but written earlier. It contained $20 and a brief note in German. For Elsa's schooling, more soon. Samuel Reed had no close family. His few possessions were catalogued after his disappearance by the boarding house owner where he had lived. Among them, a pocket watch that had belonged to his wife, a Bible with her name inscribed on the first page, and a photograph of the two of them on their wedding day. David Ames's wife, Margaret, testified in 1903 that her husband had been eager but not reckless. He wanted to provide, she said. He wanted our daughter to have what he didn't. She held the baby during the interview. The baby's name was Grace. And Thomas. Thomas had a mother and a sister. His mother, in her statement to the police, described her son as a good boy, a quiet boy, always thinking. She said he had been honored to be chosen by his uncle. She said he had packed carefully, folding each item with precision. She said he had hugged her before he left, longer than usual. She said she knew something was wrong when she woke up on the morning of January 10th with a pain in her chest that would not ease. The last confirmed sighting of the 7 men occurred on January 12, 1903. A trapper named Edwin Marsh encountered them approximately 9 miles north of Allegheny, along the remnants of an old logging road. Marsh was running his trapline and was surprised to see anyone that deep in the forest in winter. He approached the group and spoke briefly with Martin Felton. Marsh's testimony, given to authorities on February 3, 1903, is one of the few primary sources that describes the men in the field. They were camped off the road, maybe 30 yards back in a clearing. I saw smoke from their fire and went to see who it was. Mr. Felton was civil. He said they were surveying for the timber company and expected to finish in 3 or 4 days. I asked if they needed anything. He said no. The men were in good spirits. One of them, I believe it was the younger Devine, was cooking something in a pot. Another man, the German, was sharpening an axe. The boy, the youngest one, was sitting on a log writing in a notebook. I did not speak to him directly, but I saw him. He looked well. Marsh asked Martin if they had seen much game. Martin said they'd seen deer sign, but hadn't taken any yet. Marsh offered advice on where to find a creek that hadn't frozen over. Martin thanked him. They shook hands. Marsh left. He later described the parting as entirely unremarkable. I had no sense of trouble, he said. They seemed prepared. They seemed to know what they were doing. 3 days later, when the crew did not return to Allegheny as scheduled, the timber company sent a rider to inquire. The rider found nothing. On January 20th, a search party was organized. The search party, led by the same guide, Henry Watts, retraced the route to the last known camp. They found it without difficulty. The clearing Edwin Marsh had described was there, scorched earth marking where the fire had been. There were marks in the frozen ground indicating tent stakes. There were boot prints, many of them overlapping and confused. But there was no other trace. No abandoned equipment, no supplies, no signs of struggle. The search party expanded their radius, moving in concentric circles outward from the clearing. They found nothing. On January 24th, a second search party was dispatched, this one larger, nearly 30 men, including local hunters, timber workers, and a deputy sheriff from Westmoreland County. They searched for 6 days. They covered an area of approximately 40 square miles. They found frozen streams, dense laurel thickets, rocky outcroppings, and one abandoned line shack from an earlier logging operation, empty except for a rusted stove. They found no bodies, no clothing, no tools, no rifles. On February 2nd, the search was called off due to deteriorating weather. A blizzard moved through the region, dropping 16 inches of snow and making further efforts impossible. In March, when the thaw began, a third search was conducted. Again, nothing. The official conclusion, recorded in the case file and signed by the Westmoreland County Sheriff, was that the men had likely succumbed to exposure, possibly after becoming disoriented in a sudden storm, and that their remains were either buried under snow and debris in an area not yet searched, or had been scattered by scavengers. The case was left open, but no active investigation continued. The families were offered the company's condolences and a small settlement for lost wages. Most accepted. Margaret Ames, David's widow, refused the money and demanded the search continue. Her petition was denied. And then, for 15 years, there was silence. What happened in the woods is unknown. This is the central fact around which all inquiry circles and from which it can never escape. There are no witnesses. There is no physical evidence. There is only the absence of 6 men and the inexplicable survival of a 7th. Theories emerged, of course. In 1903, some speculated that the men had been attacked by animals, by other men, by some unspecified danger. But there were no signs of violence at the camp, no blood, no indication of flight. Others suggested they had become lost and separated, succumbing to the cold individually in different locations. But the men were experienced. They had compasses, maps, and intimate knowledge of winter survival. The idea that all 6 would perish while the youngest and least experienced would survive strained credulity. A darker theory circulated quietly, that Thomas himself had been responsible, that something had happened, a dispute perhaps or an accident, and that Thomas had harmed the others or abandoned them and then hidden the evidence. But this theory collapsed under the weight of its own logistics. Thomas was 17, slight of build, and by all accounts the least capable of the group in terms of physical strength or wilderness skill. The idea that he could overpower 6 grown men, dispose of their bodies so thoroughly that no trace was ever found, and then successfully evade detection for 15 years was absurd. And yet, the question remained, where had Thomas been? The boarding house attic, where he was found in 1918, showed signs of long-term habitation, but not 15 years' worth. The dust patterns, the condition of the blanket, the absence of significant waste, all suggested he had been there for months, perhaps a year at most. So where had he been before that? Margaret Lusk, the boarding house owner, was questioned extensively. She had purchased the property in January 1918, but the previous owner, a man named George Trowbridge, had died in 1917. Trowbridge's estate record showed he had owned the building since 1912. Who had owned it before that? The title search revealed a series of short-term owners and transfers, some of them unclear, some involving settling of debts. Had Thomas been in the attic the entire time, moving from owner to owner, somehow undetected? Impossible. The attic access had been nailed shut from the outside. Someone had to have sealed him in, or sealed him in repeatedly across multiple owners, unless he had sealed himself in. But why? And who had fed him? The tin cup found in the attic was analyzed. It contained residue consistent with water, nothing more. The chamber pot was empty but had been used. There were no food scraps, no wrappers, no stores of provisions. Bill Coughlin, the lodger who discovered Thomas, was asked if he had noticed anyone bringing food to the house. He said he had not. He had lived there for only 3 weeks. Margaret Lusk said the same. She had seen no one. A canvass of the neighborhood turned up nothing. No one remembered seeing a man matching Thomas's description. No one recalled suspicious activity around the boarding house. The police theorized that Thomas had been receiving help, that someone had known he was there, had been bringing him food and water, had been complicit in his concealment. But who? And why would Thomas not say? The pressure on Thomas Felton to speak was immense. It came first from the authorities, who needed answers for their records, for the families, for the integrity of a case that had haunted the county for 15 years. Detective Lieutenant Francis Howell, the lead investigator assigned to the reopened case, spent hours with Thomas in the days following his discovery. Howell's notes, preserved in the case file, reveal a man growing increasingly frustrated. March 10th. Subject remains silent. Responds to yes/no questions with nods or shakes of head. Will not write anything substantive. Appears calm. No agitation, no visible distress. When asked about the other men, he closes his eyes, but does not speak. March 12th. Attempted new approach. Presented subject with photographs of the missing men. Subject examined each photograph carefully. When shown photo of Martin Felton, his uncle, subject's hand trembled, but he set the photo down and said nothing. Asked directly if his uncle was dead. Subject nodded. Asked how he died. Subject turned away. March 15th. Brought in James Callahan's son, now age 24. Thought perhaps seeing a familiar face might provoke response. Subject recognized him. The son asked where his father was. Subject shook his head slowly. The son began to weep. Subject closed his eyes. The son became angry, demanded answers. Subject did not respond. Interview terminated. Howell tried everything. He brought in a stenographer and asked Thomas to dictate his account. Thomas refused. He brought in a priest. Thomas prayed but did not confess anything to Howell. He brought in Thomas's sister, Anna, who had traveled from Harrisburg. Anna's testimony is perhaps the most haunting. In an interview conducted by a newspaper reporter in 1920, she described sitting with her brother in the hospital room. I held his hand. I told him I didn't care what had happened, that I only wanted him to be at peace. I told him our mother had died in 1910, that she had never stopped hoping he would come home. When I said that, he wept. It was the only time I saw him cry, but he didn't speak. I asked him if he had suffered. He nodded. I asked if the others had suffered. He closed his eyes. I asked if he had been alone all these years. He didn't respond. I asked him why he wouldn't tell us. He looked at me, and I will never forget the look. It wasn't defiance and it wasn't shame. It was something else. It was like he was protecting me, like speaking would hurt me more than silence. Anna visited him 3 more times before he was released from the hospital. Each time she tried to coax him into speaking. Each time he remained silent. After his release, Thomas disappeared into the city, and Anna lost track of him. She heard rumors over the years that he was working in a factory, that he was living in a rooming house, that he attended Mass regularly, but she never saw him again. In a letter written to a friend in 1939, 2 years before Thomas's death, Anna wrote, I have accepted that I will never know. Perhaps it is better that way. Tommy made a choice, and I have to believe it was the right one, even if I cannot understand it. The families of the missing men reacted differently. Margaret Ames, David's widow, demanded a meeting with Thomas. It was arranged by Detective Howell on March 16, 1918. Margaret brought her daughter Grace, now 15 years old. The meeting took place in a small office at the police station. Margaret's account, given to a journalist in 1925, describes it as the most painful moment of her life. He was sitting in a chair when we arrived. Grace had never seen him before. She was just a baby when David left. I introduced her. I said, "This is Grace. Your father went into the woods with this man." Thomas looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Grace asked him, "Do you know what happened to my father?" He didn't answer. I asked him if David had suffered. He didn't answer. I asked him if David had said anything about us at the end. He didn't answer. I became angry. I told him he owed us the truth. He looked at me with such sadness, but he didn't speak. We left. Grace cried the entire way home. Margaret never sought another meeting. In her later years, she told an interviewer that she had come to believe Thomas's silence was not cruelty, but something else, something she couldn't name but felt in her bones was necessary. Catherine Felton, Martin's widow, did not seek a meeting with Thomas. When asked why by a reporter in 1918, she said simply, "If he could tell me, he would. That's enough." Peter Devine's mother wrote Thomas a letter in April of 1918. It was delivered to the address listed on his hospital release form, a boarding house on the north side. The letter has not survived, but the mother later told a priest that she had asked only one question: "Did my son know he was dying?" She never received a reply. Public interest in the case was intense but brief. In the weeks following Thomas's discovery, newspapers across Pennsylvania ran stories with headlines like "Man Found After 15 Years, Refuses to Speak," and "Sole Survivor of 1903, Tragedy, Silent on Fate of 6. There was speculation, sensationalism, and no small amount of invention. But Thomas did not grant interviews. He did not appear in public. He did not defend himself or explain himself. And eventually, the newspapers moved on. By the summer of 1918, with the Great War raging in Europe and the Spanish flu beginning its deadly march across the country, the strange case of Thomas Felton faded from the front pages. The families were left with their grief. The authorities were left with an unsolved case. And Thomas was left with his silence. There is one final interview worth noting. In 1936, a graduate student in history at the University of Pittsburgh, researching unsolved disappearances in western Pennsylvania, managed to locate Thomas Felton. The student, whose name was Robert Tierney, later published a brief account of the encounter in a regional history journal. Tierney described finding Thomas living in a small rented room in the north side, working as a night janitor at a factory. Tierney knocked on the door. Thomas answered. Tierney introduced himself and explained his research. Thomas listened politely. Tierney asked if he could ask a few questions. Thomas stepped aside and let him in. The room was spare. A bed, a chair, a small table, a crucifix on the wall, a stack of books, mostly religious texts. Tierney sat. Thomas remained standing. Tierney asked about the winter of 1903. Thomas said nothing. Tierney asked about the 6 men. Thomas said nothing. Tierney, perhaps sensing he would get nowhere with direct questions, changed tactics. He asked if Thomas believed in forgiveness. Thomas nodded. Tierney asked if Thomas had been forgiven. Thomas paused, then nodded again. Slowly, Tierney asked one more question. He asked if Thomas thought the families deserved to know what happened. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked to the door and opened it. Tierney understood. He gathered his notes and left. As he was stepping into the hallway, Thomas spoke. It was the only recorded instance of Thomas speaking about the case. He said, "Some truths are heavier than silence." Then he closed the door. The historical record ends with Thomas Felton's death in 1941. He died alone in a charity hospital of pneumonia. The attending nurse noted that in his final hours he was delirious and spoke in fragments. She did not record what he said. When asked years later if she remembered, she said only that he seemed to be speaking to people who weren't there. He was buried, as noted, in a Catholic cemetery. The grave is modest. The headstone bears his name, his birth and death years, and nothing more. There is no epitaph. Over the decades, the case has been revisited periodically by journalists, historians, and amateur investigators. Each has attempted to solve the mystery of what happened in the winter of 1903. None have succeeded. Some have focused on the logistics of survival, questioning how Thomas could have lived for 15 years in hiding without leaving a more substantial trail. Others have examined the possibility of conspiracy, that Thomas was aided by others, perhaps by someone with a vested interest in keeping the truth hidden. A few have even suggested that the other 6 men survived as well, that they scattered and assumed new identities, and that Thomas's silence was a pact among them all. But these theories, however elaborate, fail to account for the simplest and most profound fact of the case. Thomas Felton did not want to speak. This was not the silence of trauma, though trauma was surely present. It was not the silence of guilt, though guilt may have been a companion. It was not the silence of fear, though what he had witnessed may well have been fearsome. It was the silence of choice, and it was a choice he made not once, but continuously, for 38 years. Every time he was asked, he chose silence. Every time he was pressured, he chose silence. Every time he was offered sympathy, absolution, understanding, he chose silence. Why? The theories advanced over the years can be grouped into three broad categories. First, Thomas was protecting himself. Perhaps he had done something, through action or inaction, that led to the deaths of the others, and his silence was self-preservation. But this theory struggles against the evidence of his character. Those who knew him described a man of deep faith, regular in his religious observances, quietly kind in his interactions. If he carried guilt, would he not have sought confession, penance, some form of atonement beyond mere silence? Second, Thomas was protecting others. Perhaps someone else was responsible for what happened, someone still living, and Thomas's silence was a shield. But who? And why would Thomas sacrifice his own peace, his own reputation, his relationships with his family, to protect them? Third, Thomas was protecting the truth itself. Perhaps what happened was so terrible, so incomprehensible, so destructive to the memory of the dead or the peace of the living, that speaking it would cause more harm than good. This third theory is the one that most historians find compelling, not because it explains what happened, but because it explains the silence. Consider what we know. 6 men went into the woods with Thomas. None of them returned. Their bodies were never found. Thomas survived. Consider what Thomas knew. He knew how they died. He knew where they died. He knew, perhaps, why they died. He knew, and he chose not to say. Now consider the people who asked him to speak. Margaret Ames, who wanted to know if her husband suffered. Catherine Felton, who wanted to know if her husband thought of her at the end. James Callahan's son, who wanted to know if his father had been brave. What if the truth Thomas carried would have answered those questions in ways that destroyed the comfort of uncertainty? What if David Ames had not died quickly or bravely or thinking of his wife and daughter? What if Martin Felton had made a choice that led to the deaths of the others? What if the manner of their deaths was such that knowing it would haunt the families more than not knowing? Silence in such a case would not be cruelty, it would be mercy. There is a moment in Anna Felton's 1920 interview that deserves closer attention. She described her brother's expression when she asked him why he wouldn't speak. She said it looked like he was protecting her. Protecting her from what? From knowledge. From a truth that, once spoken, could not be unspoken. From a reality that would replace the constructed narratives of heroism, tragedy, and fate that the families had built around their loss. This interpretation suggests that Thomas understood something fundamental about grief, that it requires a story, and that sometimes the absence of a story is easier to bear than a story too painful to accept. In 1958, a retired priest named Father Michael Corrigan was interviewed by a local historian about his years serving in Pittsburgh's North Side parishes. Corrigan had known Thomas Felton in the 1930s. He described him as a faithful parishioner who attended Mass every Sunday and often stayed after to pray alone. The historian asked if Thomas had ever confessed what happened in 1903. Father Corrigan, bound by the seal of confession, could not and did not answer directly. But he did say this: there are some burdens that cannot be shared, not because they are too heavy to speak, but because speaking them transfers the weight to others. Thomas understood that. He carried what he carried so that others would not have to. The final document in the case file is a letter, undated, written in a hand identified by graphologists as belonging to Thomas Felton. It was found among his possessions after his death and turned over to authorities. It has never been made public, but a transcript exists in the archives. To whoever reads this, I have been asked many times to tell what happened. I cannot. Not because I do not remember, but because I remember too well. The men I went into the woods with were good men. They deserve to be remembered as such. What happened to them does not change that, but telling it would. I have made my peace with God. I hope that is enough. If my silence has caused pain, I am sorry, but it is the only kindness I have left to give. Thomas Felton. In the end, we are left with questions. What happened in the Chestnut Ridge Wilderness in January of 1903? How did 6 experienced men vanish without a trace? How did a 17-year-old boy survive when they did not? Where was Thomas Felton for 15 years? Who, if anyone, helped him? And why, above all else, did he refuse to speak? The answers are gone. They died with Thomas in 1941, if not before. What remains is the silence. And perhaps, in that silence, a lesson. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Not all truths are meant to be told. Some things are kept quiet not out of shame or fear, but out of a fierce, protective love for those who would be hurt by knowing. Thomas Felton made a choice. He chose to carry the weight alone. He chose to let the questions stand unanswered. He chose to be misunderstood, suspected, even condemned, rather than speak words that could not be taken back. Whether that choice was right or wrong is not for us to say, but it was his, and he kept it.